Hello and welcome to episode 108 of Page One, the Writers Podcast. I'm Marco.
And I'm Tarek.
And thanks for joining us at Page One, where we like to speak to writers of all kinds about their writing careers, talk about their process and try and get as many hints and tips as possible. And we have a huge back catalogue of some really great authors, screenwriters, comic writers. So please do go and check that out if this is your first episode. But if it is your first episode, it's a great first episode, Tarek.
It's a fantastic first episode because this week we are chatting with the awesome Rob Hart, who is an American author, novelist, and journalist. He kind of started off writing crime novels, his 5-book crime thriller series, Ash McKenna novels, and then he kind of pivoted away from crime and went into kind of semi-sci-fi speculative fiction.
Sort of near future
fiction. Stuff, yeah. With The Warehouse, which is a kind of what would happen if Amazon did everything type story.
Yeah. It's great. I really loved it.
You were a big fan of it.
Yeah. And it's drawn comparisons. The reviews were sort of like 1984, Fahrenheit 451. So big comparisons. But I think live up to it in the sense of what the message that the book's trying to get across there. It's a thriller, but it's also issues that he wanted to raise in that book. And I think, and we talked to him about that and the importance of books like that and whether they actually have an impact, even if people sort of recognise what the issues are.
Realise there's issues, exactly. It's one thing to have to say, oh, there's definitely an issue here, another thing to actually act on it, I suppose. Yeah.
But and we also talked to him, a really interesting chat about his process because he has an interesting redrafting process which involves, well, in fact, I'm not going to spoil it because we'll save that for we can maybe chat
what
about
his interesting process
exactly.
is.
We can chat about it after the podcast.
Yeah.
But it's a really good chat. Rob is a really great guy to speak with, and we talk also about representation in books and chat about what it was like to be a co-author with a certain James Patterson.
Yeah, quite a cool little gig there if you can get it, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll get into after an advert for our writer's notebook. But before we do that, we just wanted to remind you that this very weekend, if you're listening to this on the day of release, is the Chimera Science Fiction, Fantasy and Horror Festival in Edinburgh, Scotland. And we are sponsors of that festival. We're doing a couple of recorded talks and also we're doing a live episode of the podcast.
Very exciting.
Tomorrow, Saturday at 1 p.m.
Tomorrow?
At the Pleasance.
A day of recording. Tomorrow as when the episode goes out, not at time of recording.
Yes.
Sorry, that makes more sense. I was panicking there for a moment.
Yeah, at the Pleasance in Edinburgh. So if you need a ticket, you can book it on the website. There's a link in the podcast description. But otherwise, it's free to come along, and we'd love to have some of our listeners there in the audience. That would be amazing. And obviously, you get to not only hear us and see us, you also get to see, of course, much more importantly, Adrian Tchaikovsky. And we're sure it'll be a great chat. So, if you are in Edinburgh and fancy that, please do come along. But we'll get on with the podcast now, and then we'll be back at the end of the podcast with a bit more chat.
But for now, on with the podcast.
The blank page. To some, it's terrifying, an obstacle to overcome. But we prefer to think of it as an opportunity, a blank canvas to be filled with all of the adventures and characters in our head. So how to overcome that fear? Well, we all know the best advice for a writer is write. Seriously, get words on the page and more will follow.
But what about later, when you start trying to pull those threads of what you've written together? What about the character you wrote about way back at the start? Who was she again? What was she carrying? And where did she leave the MacGuffin that she now really needs in the third act? Think about all those top thrillers you like to read, or that amazing drama you just watched. What did they all have in common? Structure and planning.
As aspiring writers ourselves, we've tried many different methods to try and organise all the thoughts about the stories we want to tell. We've been there searching for a piece of scrap paper to note something down, or making a quick note on our phone in between meetings.
Or sometimes we'll make a note in whatever notebook we're carrying, or a document on our laptop so we don't forget that great idea. Let's be honest, it can all be a bit messy and it's easy to lose track of everything. And that's when we realised it's not just the story that needs structure and planning, but the way we gather all of our thoughts about it as well.
And so we made Page One. Page One is more than just another notebook. It's a place to put down all your ideas for your latest project, divided into easy-to-use sections that will help you plan your story, so that when that blank page comes calling, you're ready to answer. And then afterwards, once it's written, we realised you need to plan how to let people read it, so we included a section relating to submissions.
Each one is designed for one project, whether you want to write a book, screenplay, a comic, or any other kind of story. We truly believe that when you use it, it will help you get to the main event, writing your story. So we hope this helps.
We can't wait to read what you come up with.
And remember, every story starts with page one.
Did you always want to be a writer? Because I think I'm right in saying you started in journalism and then went into or worked in politics a bit as well.
Yeah. I wanted to be an artist when I was a kid, and I went to school for graphic design, and within my first semester realized it was just not for me. And I ended up switching over to journalism because I was like, well, I want to get into writing, and it would be cool to maybe write books one day. But I thought journalism was a little bit more applicable to real life. Like I could get a job, and creative writing degree is unfortunately not always the best way to get a job. So yeah, I was a journalist for 4 years and then jumped ship for politics and did that for a little while, and eventually got burnt out and started working for a small publisher, just to kind of like give myself the space to write. So I mean, I decided I wanted to write books when I was 18, and I think my first book came out when I was 32. So took a little bit of time, but I got there eventually.
And so was it only from 18 that you were sort of writing in the background, as it were, or were you writing stories as a kid as well, and sort of developing over that period?
Yeah, no, it was really it was around when I was 18 that it started. And when I was a kid, I was always artistically inclined. When I was in grade school, we had to do like composition essays, like short stories every week, and my teacher was always very encouraging with that. And I was more of a reader than a writer. Like I was always a big reader when I was a kid, and then just kind of slowly moved into it.
And then you were working for, is it Mysterious Press? That was
yeah.
the place you're working for. I mean, that must have been a really great kind of insight to how the industry worked, and to see how the deals that were kind of being made, the sort of books that people were buying, etc.
Yeah, it was a fun little gig because essentially it was the guy who owns the Mysterious Bookshop in Tribeca in Manhattan. And he had this sort of side gig where the Mysterious Press was taking old crime and mystery books and turning them into ebooks, like
cool.
stuff that's been out of print forever and wouldn't really be economically feasible to put them back in print, but to release them as ebooks would be okay. And so we had some stuff by like James Ellroy and, so some like bigger names, but then like some cool stuff like Charlotte McLeod and, Charles Williams, like lesser known names. And we worked with like a couple of thousand books. And yeah, it was nice because I was technically working for a small indie press, but I still was in New York. So I got to get some sort of entree to the publishing community. And it helped me learn a little bit about how the system works, like kind of the behind the scenes stuff.
And when did you decide to put yourself out there, as it were, in terms of your own writing?
I was trying for a while. I mean, my first book, it came out in 2015, so I was about 32. I'd been trying for years to write it and get it published. I think it was probably like 5 or 6 years. I had written a book previous to that, but it just really kind of didn't come together. It is sitting in the drawer of my filing cabinet, and I have given my mom instructions to destroy it upon my death. I just do not want anyone
says that, but
everyone's got one they got to burn off.
Why keep it if you don't want anyone to ever see it again?
Because sometimes it's fun to kind of look at and say like, wow, like what was I thinking? But yeah, no, it was I was trying for a really long time, and then the first book came out. My first book came out with a small press called Polis, and I ended up writing a couple of 5 books in that series in total. And because it was a small press, they got really good coverage. They got really good, media, really good bookstore placement, but still, you're kind of fighting an uphill battle. And then it was really like, it was the warehouse deal that kind of like let me become a full-time writer and just really focus on this as a career.
And when you were, so your first full length novel was New York. Is that
Yeah.
right? Yeah. And when you were, so you had this book written. What was your process at that point when going out there trying to find agents, look at the publishers? Did you go? Do you think about putting it out there yourself? What was the thought process behind all that?
It was a weird process. I got lucky in that I was at a conference with I worked with this website called Lit Reactor. That's like a website for readers and writers. And we rented a table at a conference in Portland, Oregon, and there was an agent there who also worked with the site. The two of us really hit it off, and she heard that I was a writer, and she was like, "Cool, send me something." And I sent her the book, and she liked it, and we ended up getting a 2-book deal with an imprint called Exhibit A, which is part of Angry Robot, which is a British publisher. And then, like 2 months after I signed the contract, the imprint shut down, so the contract was cut loose. And then what happened was Polis, which had initially made an offer, but they were only doing ebooks at that point. They came back to me and they said, "Well, we're doing print now too. Would you like to do this?" And I was like, "Well, yeah, that'd be great." So yeah, it was kind of like this weird process where the agent part came really easy, and it felt like the publishing part came really hard because we sent it out to all the big publishers and it got rejected by all of them. Which looking back now, I totally understand. It was not a big press book. It was sort of like a smaller, riskier book that a small press was better suited for. And yeah, it was a lot of learning. And I'm glad to have had the process. I actually tell people I think it's great to start with a smaller press and move up to a bigger press, because you learn how to work with an editor, how to promote yourself, like how to sort of like guard your expectations. And I think it's when even having published 5 books, like jumping into the world with like Warehouse was like, it was still kind of a shock to the system.
And that's interesting what you say there about the small press being willing to take more risks essentially on a different type of story, I suppose. But is they always say don't write for the market. Write the story
Yeah.
that you're wanting to tell, and then find the market for it essentially. But do you have to, if you are aiming for a bigger press deal, do you have to have certain parts of the market in mind?
You know, it's such a weird thing. It's such a weird thing. So I'm currently in this situation where, I want to start working on my next book, and I've got a couple of ideas. And, it's a lot of conversations with both my agent and my editor, whom I want to continue working with, about what is going to be best suited for both my career and for the market, but also like make me happy as a writer and be fulfilling. That said, and again, going back to Warehouse, this is a book that was hypercritical of Amazon, which controls 75% of book sales in the US. And I was convinced no one was going to touch it. I was like, no one's like, if I'm lucky, like a small press that's willing to poke the bear would be willing to do this. No way is a major press going to do this. No one wants to bite the hand that feeds them. So I'm glad that I went in there kind of like full bore and was like, I'm just going to write this the way I want to write it. We'll see how it breaks down. And so, yeah, it's always worth, I think, thinking about to a degree, but I also don't know that it's worth holding yourself back over.
Yeah. Yeah, I suppose that makes sense. And yeah, well, let's talk about the Warehouse brief just now, which I have a copy of here. For those that haven't read it, do you want to summarize it?
Sure, sure. I mean, it's essentially what would happen if Amazon completely took over the retail economy. And it kind of springs out from things like, the old coal mining towns and like Foxconn in Asia, where, they have these like, you basically live where you work. So, your company controls like everything about your life. It's kind of like a closed circuit of capitalism. So it's about this one company sort of building these big live work facilities in the US, and people sort of running out of options for where to work besides there. So they have to go get jobs with this company Cloud, and they're kind of stuck in the system. And, and part of the reason that it's fun to have these conversations is I also, when I was writing this, thought it was a very uniquely US problem. I thought it was a uniquely American problem. And so when we got such a great response from foreign publishers, I think we ended up in like 22 countries. It was like, oh man, like I completely misjudged everything about this.
Yeah, no, it certainly resonated when when I was reading it as well. It's definitely recognisable as an issue here. And in the author's note for that book, you also say that you specifically set out to write an issues book, if you like.
Yeah.
Why did you want to do that? And is there a danger if you set out to do that you can turn some people off?
Yeah, it's interesting because on one hand, like I'm very proud of where I stand politically. So, if someone doesn't agree with my politics, they don't have to buy my book. Like, I don't care. You go believe what you want to believe. It's fine. Part of the reason I wanted to do this is because one of the most formative books for me as a writer was Fahrenheit 451, which I loved that it's like a really fun, exciting book. It's basically a thriller, but it's also like it's an issues book, and I've always been a big fan of that. 1984 is another great example of books that like they have. It's the the joke I keep on making is that it's like, when I want to get my daughter to eat her broccoli, I sneak it into her mac and cheese so she'll eat it, and it's like, she gets a palatable meal, but she gets her vitamins too. And that's kind of what this feels like. It feels like almost sneaky. It's like, I'm going to give you like kind of like this fun, thrillery sort of, spec book. And at the end of the day, maybe you're going to walk away with some kind of message about how late stage capitalism is bad.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and you think, I totally agree with that. And I think that it's almost easier to get that message across to people in a way that they don't. Yeah, it's almost like your daughter's meal, isn't it? They don't realize what they're getting, and it's maybe an idea that kind of maybe sits in their head a little bit, and it's almost, it gets them to engage with a topic or a question that they probably wouldn't have even thought about engaging with otherwise. And they would never have watched a lecture or read a news article perhaps about it. But when it's put through the guise of fiction, it almost becomes easier to swallow.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Because fiction is an empathy machine.
Yeah.
It's so much easier. Like I did so much research for this book. I probably could have written a pretty solid nonfiction book about why Amazon's a bad company. But when you create characters and you kind of put the reader in their shoes, people can kind of find that, those universal threads, and they can sort of understand it and feel it a little bit better. Because like, I've never worked in a fulfillment center like the characters in the books, but I know what it's like to have to work unpaid overtime, to feel undervalued, to feel like I'm being run into the ground, to work for people who like don't value what I'm doing. And, there are connecting threads. It's just a matter of finding them.
And did you have a fear? Because in the book, there's a without spoiling anything too much, there's a thread that talks about whether certain books are not being promoted or supplied, essentially things like The Handmaid's Tale, I think it is in the book.
Yeah.
And then it turns out that the books are there. It's just that no one's actually ordering them because everything else is being made available. I mean, did you have a fear with Amazon, I suppose, that might happen to your book?
I certainly thought that. I don't we've seen no evidence that Amazon, tried to like downplay this. And, I honestly don't think Jeff Bezos cares. That guy's got enough money. He's no, fine. Exactly, I'd be shocked if he even knew, like, if he even knew about my book. But yeah, I was actually just kind of fascinated by this idea of how, as a society, we're always really keyed into stories like this, but we never seem to listen to them. I mean, like, how many great stories are there about how we're completely destroying the planet, and it has not stopped us from destroying the planet. It's like there's this disconnect between like the way we sometimes celebrate these stories and then how we actually like put those into effect in our day-to-day lives.
So what's your process then when you come to sit down and write? It sounds like you did a lot of research into places like Foxconn, etc., how these factories stroke homes work. So do you do a lot of planning up front, and does that extend to the actual story itself? Do you plan out the plot before you start writing?
Yeah. I need to outline a lot. I really, the research phase is usually pretty long for me because, as a former journalist, that's one of my superpowers. I love the research phase. which for this was actually most of my research was into Walmart, because Amazon is a relatively new company in the grand scale of the economy, but Walmart was established in the United States in the 1960s, so you can more clearly see how they shaped and influenced the economy. But yeah, I did a ton of reading, a ton of research, and then just really it's for me, it's about kind of like breaking the characters, figuring out who needs to tell the story, and then roughing out an idea of like what it needs to look like. And within that process, I get pretty exacting on it. I have a map of the warehouse facility that I
Right.
drew, because I realized like I can't like I need to situate myself in this space so I can understand it. And actually sitting down and drawing the map, I got a big piece of poster board that helped me solve some plot problems, which was nice. But yeah, usually, and I can finish a book in 6 months. But it's all that planning and prep can take like up to a year or more beforehand, and I need all that in front of me before I even get started.
When you're writing something that has a message, it's like it almost makes me think of a kind of the morality stories used to get in the old Star Trek. That kind of there was a point to the story. It was trying to tell you something beyond just what was happening. How do you write something like that in a way that doesn't come across as forced or obvious? How do you keep the plot going forward in a way that seems natural and it's not too on the nose?
That honestly, like that's a hard question to answer, because I think it's a little bit more art than science in that regard. It's like, because you're right, you don't want it to be too preachy. You don't want people to read the book and feel like they just got lectured at. They want to read the book and they want to enjoy it. So, but you want to get your point across. You don't want to bury it so deeply that people just can't key into it. So yeah, it's I also like I my editorial process is pretty intense. I'll do like 5 or 6 like really deep passes on a book before anyone reads it. And then I'm very lucky in the sense that like both my agent, my editor are like very brilliant story technicians. And they know when to kind of like push me or pull me back. But yeah, it's I think the first stage is just keeping that balanced mind and just remembering that like your chief goal is to entertain the person who's reading it and not lecture them.
And in that process, you said you sort of do 5 drafts or so before you show it to someone. Do you try and get a first draft out, get the basic skeleton of the story out, as it were, and then sort of hone it as you go? Is that your method, or do you revise as you go?
I try to get the first thing out like in one pass, just because it's easier for me to kind of have it on the page. And I tend to, my first drafts are usually a lot shorter than the final book.
Right.
I know a lot of people will write a lot and then kind of cut down. I tend to write shorter and then kind of go in and like build things up. And but yeah, it's usually like 5 or 6 passes, and I always try to do like one pass backwards, where I start with like the last chapter and I work my way through to the front.
Oh, that's interesting.
Which I find very valuable in the sense that it's helpful to see the plot out of order sometimes. It could help you kind of like help, solve problems or see how the pacing is. But it also, I think it puts fresh energy into the ending. Because sometimes when you get to the end, you're like, Jesus, I'm just so glad this is over.
Yeah,
You're kind of
no, it's
rushing a
true,
bit.
yeah.
So if you start with the end, it's like all that fresh energy is like right there. You can really kind of let things breathe.
And
Sorry.
I was going to say you worked as a journalist for a while, and so I'm presuming you got very used to getting notes from your editors, and not having too much of a thin skin that you kind of think you take things to heart too much, or you don't want to, you go back and forth about how much to change and how quickly to change them. Is that kind of thing that's quite easy to do nowadays?
Yeah, that's something journalism really helps with that. I have a buddy who I'm collaborating with something on, and we're both former journalists, and it's such a breeze because we know that like the story's got to win in the end. That's the only important thing. But and there are certainly times where my editor or my agent has come to me and said, "Hey, you should do this," and I've been like, "Well, no, I feel very strongly about this, and this is the reason." And we have a conversation, and sometimes they're right, and I go along with it, and sometimes they're like, "Okay, we'll back your play. It's your book." So I have been lucky again in the sense that like 99% of their input is really, really great. And it's exactly what I needed to hear or to see. And that 1% is always like not a huge deal. It's like sometimes like there's a joke I want to keep in, or some weird little character turn. And it's it's a fun process. I love working with other people. I've always really enjoyed it because it's always great to get outside perspectives and outside input. And you know this, like, I'm very proud of the warehouse, and it would not be what it is without the input of other people.
And following on from the warehouse, your most recent book is The Paradox Hotel, which is
Yes.
not too long out. Again, do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, that's so I decided to go full sci-fi, and it's set in a hotel for time travelers where the US is on the verge of privatizing time travel technology. So all these like trillionaires are like bidding for control of like all of space and time. And it's about the head detective at the hotel who finds a dead body and only she can see it. And it basically turns into kind of like a locked room mystery thing. Unfortunately, we don't have a publisher in the UK yet, but I'm kind of hoping soon we might lock that down, because I've had people asking when that might happen and would love to get it over there.
Yeah, no, I was actually looking for it and I couldn't find it, so that explains why
Yep.
that's the case then. And I believe it's got quite a sort of diverse set of cast of characters, in terms of the main characters and things like that.
Yeah.
Which, obviously very refreshing to see. Do you think that is something that is important in books being written now, that you don't just want your, in 20 years ago, that I'm sure the main character in that sort of story would have been your average straight white male character and so on, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of took it as a challenge. The narrator is a queer woman, and it was like, okay, this is something that scares me, so I'm gonna give it a try. Um, the as for writing a diverse cast, I mean, I try to write the world as I see it, and I
Mm.
was born and raised and still live in New York City, so I've always lived in a very diverse place. Um, but I also think that representation really matters. It's very important. And just now, I was having this conversation a couple of days ago. So a friend of mine is going to be in the new Miss Marvel TV show.
Oh,
That's
cool.
going to be on Disney Plus, and he's playing an imam. And he's so excited that, like, there's going to be like young Muslim girls are going to be able to see like a show that like represents them in the superhero arena. And and that's incredible and great. And that's the story. Like, that's not a story I can tell, because that's not my experience. But it's always exciting when people say like, hey, like, I saw myself in this. In Warehouse, I had a character in a wheelchair, and she was just there. She was like her being like, she didn't have an accident in the book. She was just a supporting character. And a woman wrote to me, and she's like, I've been in a wheelchair for most of my life, and I've never read something where there was just a character in a wheelchair who was just like not like some sort of like function of the plot. And
Hmm.
she was really thankful for that. And I really took that to heart. It was like, okay, like, cool, this makes me happy. And there's always finding that balance of like making sure I'm not trying to transpose my experience on someone else's, because one of the characters in Paradox is trans. And that's something I went into, very carefully. I had two friends, both of whom are incredible authors, both of whom are trans, who gave me input. And one of them read the book, and she helped me kind of like understand the points where I needed to be a little bit more mindful. So yeah, no, as a white dude, it's a bit of a balancing act, but I think it's important. Because again, like, we live in a diverse world. It would be ridiculous to not write a diverse cast of characters.
No, I agree 100% with everything you've said there. It's interesting though, because I'm currently going through the query process, and with my own writing, and an agent. One of my characters was a black person who, again, was that simply for a diverse cast of characters. I wasn't trying to, as you say, transpose myself onto them, my experiences onto them. But they said, you shouldn't do this. You don't have the experiences of that, of being a black person, so you shouldn't do this. And I totally get where they're coming from, but I think it depends on the type of story and what you're trying to do with that character, really. Because, like you say, you want representation, you want a diverse cast. It's a good thing to have that, and it seems a bit limiting. People almost seem scared of it at the moment in publishing in some circles.
Yeah, I think, there's kind of a line, like, I can't write a book about what the trans experience is like. I can't
Mm-hmm.
write a book about what the Black experience
Yeah,
is like.
absolutely.
I can't write a book and saying, like, I understand this, even though it's not mine, because then you're taking possession of it from someone else. But to have those characters and have them like fully fleshed out in this world where they're there because they're there, I think that's perfectly within bounds. But again, you just got to go into it with you got to go into it with some mindfulness, and you also have to be willing to be called out on it.
Absolutely, yeah.
One of the things that I learned, I read this somewhere a couple of years ago. It was the white assumption in fiction. It was that, how authors would only point out a character's race if they were not a white character. So it was just this assumption that all characters were white until it was said otherwise. So I've been a little bit more mindful about, like, pointing out the races of characters regardless of their race, just to kind of like create a little bit of, like, consistency there.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to ask about your move from kind of straight up crime or mystery books into this kind of sci-fi, because the Warehouse is kind of in that wheelhouse, but then the Paradox Hotel is really in the wheelhouse. And is that something you really quite find exciting? Is that something you want to stay in, play in a bit more?
Yeah, it was great writing my first 5 books, which were, sort of like traditional, like, amateur PI books. But yeah, I just wanted a bigger sandbox with more toys, and also after writing a 5-book series, I kind of got tired of, like, living within the same universe. I wanted to do, like, single books where I can just kind of like blow up the sandbox at the end and then walk away. But I like big weird ideas, like the one that I'm working on that I hope will be my next book is actually like kind of like a weird Judeo-Christian fantasy thing that, is completely different than anything I've done before. And I tend to get a little dizzy around conversations related to genre. I think genre is, it's more for like marketing people. Like, I just want to write like weird shit that's interesting to me. like that's what I want my wheelhouse to be.
Yeah.
Is there, I suppose, going back to the marketing side of things, especially when we've spoken to crime authors before, they've been it seems that publishers can sometimes say to them, you need to stay in the world of crime if you want, because that's the audience that you built up. I mean, have you felt any pressure in that regard? I mean, clearly not, because you've moved around in genre.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still kind of writing thrillers, and there's still elements of crime fiction to everything I'm writing. So I found that a lot of my readers from my original books followed me. But yeah, I don't know. I do sometimes feel like I've got my feet in 2 different streams when it comes to, like, getting coverage with like the specialty publications or like awards consideration or whatever. It's sort of like sometimes I feel like maybe I'm not enough crime for the crime people anymore, and not enough sci-fi for the sci-fi people. Which just kind of is what it is. It's not a big deal. I again, like, I'm writing the books that are entertaining me and are making me happy, so the rest can just kind of like sort itself out.
And you also worked in a book with the man who's written about 1,000 novels, I think, James Patterson.
Yep.
It was Scott Free that was the name of that book, and I wanted to ask, how did that come about, and also what's the process like when you write with him, because he does have so many books out now, and so many of his books are written with other people, and what I kind of wondered what his role is in the collaboration.
It was interesting. So it came about because I was at a bar at a conference with an editor at that publishing house, and he was like, "Hey, we're starting this new program. It's called Book Shots. They're going to be like novella length books. Do you want your name in the ring?" And I was like, "Sure." And my first book had came out by that point, which, again, small press book. It was getting some nice reviews and some nice word of mouth, but it was not like a huge deal or anything. I figured he was being nice. And then like 2 months later, someone calls me and they're like, "Hey, like, come in on this thing." So yeah, essentially, like, I was presented with a couple of ideas, and it was like, which one appeals to you? And I took one and started kind of spinning it out, and then was like kicking it back and forth with Patterson, where he would, like, flesh things out a little bit. And, and then I did an outline, and then he had some input on that. And then I just started writing. And I would do it in chunks and send it to him, and he would send it back with notes. And I learned a lot. I mean, I know Patterson is not everyone's cup of tea, but the dude has sold more books than me, so he knows something about
Yeah.
publishing that I don't. And so I looked at it as a great learning opportunity. And yeah, I had a blast doing it. The Bookshots program ended up not really working out because what they thought that they could put out like 4 or 5 of these things a month, and if they were quicker reads, people would go through them quicker. But really what happened is that the average reader felt overwhelmed by it, and bookstores were overwhelmed. They were like, this is too much stock for us to turn over, we can't do this. And so it just never really caught on. But as opportunities go, it was a really great learning process for me.
I can see that. And more recently, you also got a chance to play in another sandbox in the Star Wars universe. You got a short story, Dune on Batu, I think. Is that what
Yeah.
it's called? How did that come about? And was that good fun playing in that universe?
Yeah, so that was Warehouse was published by Crown at Penguin Random House, but Del Rey handles like the paperback release, and they do most of like the marketing stuff on the sci-fi end. So Del Rey also handles the Star Wars books, and so I would be at like a Comic-Con with like some of the Star Wars authors who are friends of mine, and a lot of the editors who work on that, and we all just became friendly, and they were working on this project, and they were like, hey, that guy Rob's not a jerk, let's ask him to do one. And that was actually kind of terrifying, because like Star Wars fans, they will let you know if they're not happy with something. And I think I put more research into that short story than I have like individual novels. But I really dug in, and I sent it to the editor, and she was like, okay, this is pretty solid. Now we just have to send it to Lucasfilm for approval. And I was like, oh no, like this is where they learn I'm a fraud. But then Lucasfilm signed off that like there was a fact about a droid that I got wrong. So they just had like one little tweak. And I was like, okay, I will take that as a victory. But yeah, playing in Star Wars is fun because it's like the biggest sci-fi canon ever, and it's so beloved. And then to like, it's like getting, I was talking about sandboxes before. This is getting led into like the biggest, coolest sandbox ever. And like, you got to be respectful. You can't break the toys. You can't blow up the sandbox, but you can still have your fun and then move on.
And how much control do you have over like the story with something like that? When you're working with a sandbox that huge, as you say, you can't. I'm sure they say you can't kill these characters, or there's a timeline that has to happen, and canon can't be broken, etc. But how much of your own creative process can you bring in? Did you go in and say, this is a story I want to tell, or did they say it has to be set here with this kind of character and you can take it from there?
Yeah, well, so the book is basically, and it's kind of a cool concept. They had done one for A New Hope, and this was for Empire Strikes Back. And what you do is you pick a secondary character from the movie and like tell a little short story from their perspective. So it's like a retelling of the movie from all of these side characters who are kind of like on the edges of the story. And I picked my character and kind of gave them like a paragraph or two about what I wanted the story to be about, because like this is a character you see running through the background for like 10 seconds, and I was like, okay, here's how I want to build that out. And they were on board. And really, when I wrote the story, they didn't have a ton of input, and I was even able to get a little of myself in there, because I'm always going to write about like, rich people are bad, capitalism is bad, and I managed to sneak a little bit of that in there too. And so it was a really rewarding process. I thought it was going to be a lot harder, and I think right after I agreed to it, I was like, maybe I should back out of this. Maybe I shouldn't be doing this because this is terrifying. And then it just couldn't have been nicer. But like all the people there, all the people who work at Del Rey are just so lovely, and they make it like a very, very comfortable atmosphere.
Is it something you'd want to do more of, or was it a nice thing to dip your toe? Oh no, you would, yeah, excellent.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's sort of like, I think I'm like unofficially in line to maybe do a Star Wars novel one day.
Oh, excellent.
But the problem with that is that the line is very long. So it might be 5 or 10 years from now, but I will be ready when they call me.
Excellent.
And now, outside of the writing, you also do other work. You work at Lit Reactor. You mentor writers via Pitch Wars. Is it important to you to help authors kind of find their way into the industry and to guide them a little bit?
Absolutely, absolutely. I forget who said this, but I think it's really true. It's like you got to send the elevator back down. You
Mm.
know, it's there were authors who helped me when I was starting out, and so it feels really good to kind of pay that back. And it's also like it's a scary process, and it's frustrating, and there's a lot of misinformation, and there are a lot of ways you can go wrong doing it. And so, you know, mentoring people makes me feel good. From a personal perspective, from an artistic perspective, I think it's good to kind of get back to source every now and again. And sometimes like teaching a class will be so rewarding for me because it makes me sit down and actually like analyze my process and, you know, kind of see different perspectives of where people were coming from when they started out versus where I was. And, you know, I sometimes walk away from classes and lectures and stuff having learned just as much, which is always really, really rewarding.
And the warehouse, of course, was optioned by Ron Howard. Is there any update on that you're able to give us?
You know, I don't know what I can and can't talk about. I mean, it's still very much in the early stages. So they're talking to some people now, and you know, it seems to be kind of moving along. They haven't, you know, dropped it yet, which is nice. It's actually Paradox is much closer. That I've
All right.
already
Okay.
seen a pilot script for the TV show, and I think they're going
cool.
to start shopping it around like this summer. Which is really exciting because Warehouse is sort of like off on an island. Whereas with Paradox, if that goes forward, I get to write an episode, which I would love to do. I think that would be an absolute blast. So it's the Hollywood stuff just takes so long, and
Yeah.
then the hit to miss ratio is so high. You know, the chances of something happening are pretty low. So I go into it assuming it won't, because I'd rather be surprised than disappointed.
Yeah.
I mean, I could see the warehouse as well as a TV show. Actually, I think it would work well in a sort of mini-series sort of Severance type approach.
Yeah, I think there's been some conversations about maybe it's worth rethinking that. But yeah, no, I'd just be happy to see it. Like the idea of someone actually like filming and shooting something I wrote is just
Yeah.
bizarre.
And you mentioned there about hopefully writing a screenplay for one of the episodes. If it does go ahead, and is that something you'd like to do more of? You know, would you like to kind of shift a bit into the world of film and TV?
I think it would be pretty cool to write TV, you know, and this is a really good entry point. My buddy Blake Crouch recommended this. He was like, you know, if you're gonna sign an option for a TV show, you know, because my question was like, it would be really cool to be in the writer's room, but usually a writer's room for a TV show is based in LA. You know, I live in New York City. I've got a 7-year-old daughter. I don't want to move to LA for 3 or 4 months. That's just not really, that doesn't work for me. And he was like, just ask for an episode, because what's going to happen is if you do a really bad job, they will just rewrite it. If you do a really good job, it's going to lead to more TV work. So so yeah, you know, if this serves as an entry point to that, if I do a good enough job to get some more opportunities there, I would love to do that.
Excellent. And what do you have in the pipeline just now? I think you said you had a collaboration project and possibly a fantasy book as well or something.
Yeah, I've got my next novel, which I'm trying to figure out. We're almost there. I've got a book that me and my friend are co-writing that is actually more of like a Star Trek-y kind of like, it's like a John Le Carré novel set in space
Cool.
that we're hopeful about. I've got a comic book with the same friends that's coming out sometime during the summer. So it's weird. Like I've got a couple of things that are kind of bopping around, but nothing like really firmly set in stone. So mostly lately I've just been taking a lot of naps.
And is it nice having that collaborative side to things as well, when obviously writing your own novel can be quite a solitary process a lot of the time?
Oh yeah. Yeah. You know, it's the collaborations are great. You know, just the other night I got to go out and hang out with a bunch of artists at an event, and it's like it just recharges the creative batteries a little bit, you know, because that solo thing, you know, it'll wear on you after a little while, and then sometimes you just need to get back in there and remind yourself why you're doing it.
Yeah, totally. What was the last book that you read?
Well, I can tell you what I'm currently, because the last couple of books I've read, the last book I read was for a friend, which hasn't even been picked up by a publisher
Right.
yet.
Okay.
But the book I'm reading now is Kismet by Amina Akhtar, which is just this really great murder mystery set in Sedona. And I am really, really digging it.
Nice.
Excellent.
What about the last film that you watched?
Oh God, what was the last movie I watched? It was The Bad Guys. It was an animated film that I took my daughter to go see, which was
Okay.
actually pretty cute.
Excellent.
Yeah, most of my watching is like TV these days, like after she goes to sleep.
No, I get you there. And TV show. What TV show are you watching, or have you watched?
Currently, I'm reworking my way through Doctor Who.
Oh, nice.
It's been a while, so I'm on series 5, the first Matt Smith season, which I love. I thought was great. And yeah, Better Call Saul, which I think is like one of the best things on TV right now.
Yeah,
That show kill. It's actually like, I think after this, I'm gonna have lunch and like catch up on the latest episode.
Yeah, I'm absolutely loving that. Every Tuesday, I'm kind of like, this is the new day for the next episode, and it's very, very exciting. It's kind of, it's really slow paced, but you can tell it's just so much thought and plot has gone into it, and everything's keyed up to pay off down the line, and it's great watching it all come full circle at the end.
Yeah, I love how they will spend like 10 minutes doing something like really weird and obtuse that you don't understand, and
Yeah,
then all of a sudden
yeah.
it's like, oh, okay, now I get it.
Yeah, yeah. The final thing we always do is a super quick fire, either or, and I always say there's no right answer apart from one. So we'll start off with Fahrenheit 451 or 1984.
Ooh, Fahrenheit 451.
Nice.
Yeah, I reread that like once every 2 or 3 years.
Cool.
Nice. TV or cinema?
TV, mostly because, I'm at this point now where I'm tired of movies being like 3 hours long.
Yeah.
I'd rather watch stuff at my house.
There was people always say back in the 80s or 90s there was like a studio mandate that films had to be 2 hours long, no more, so they could pack them into cinemas more, get more showings of them. And everybody always looks back at that and says, oh, that was, directors were told what to do, blah blah blah, really, really bad. But I kind of like, well, there's plenty of great films from back then, and also 2 hours is normally more than enough time to tell a good story.
Yeah, of course. I've sort of fallen in love with this idea of like 90-minute films.
Yeah,
I miss that.
So Netflix have a 90-minute category now, which I was like, that's the category
They do.
for me.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna have to find that one.
Night owl or early bird?
Depends on the day. Half the time, I have to wake up at like 7 a.m. to take my daughter to school, and then most nights I don't fall asleep until like 2. So yeah, I'm running on 5 hours of sleep most nights. Yep.
Music or no music when you're writing?
Music, but music with no words. It has to be something like orchestral or electronic. I can't do like word music.
And do you listen to the same music when you're writing a story, or do you vary it up?
I tend to stick actually. 9 Inch Nails, their Ghost albums, which I think there are now like 6. Those are great writing music because they're really chill, but like they're sort of like this cool sense of dread in them. But yeah, those are usually my go-tos.
Nice. And final question: real book or ebook?
Real book. Yeah, I went through a phase where I was really enjoying ebooks, but I don't know. I just kind of miss the tactile feel. So lately, it's just been all real books for me.
Well, I've actually started listening to the 9 Inch Nails Ghost albums.
What's your thoughts?
On Rob's recommendation there when I'm writing, and if you like that sort of ambient, kind of sci-fi vibing music,
Kind of like a Brian Eno type feel to it.
A little bit, but yeah, it's very like a soundtrack, I would say.
Cool. Okay,
There's a lot of soundtrack type vibe to it. So I think, if you're writing that sort of story, then I think it could be. I think it's a great recommendation, and the good thing is, I think there's 6 albums, so there's plenty of music there to listen to as you're working on your masterpiece.
And when you're listening to your 9 Inch Nails, are you also revising your novel from the end backwards? Because that is a crazy way of editing.
But it does sound mad, obviously, but having recently gone through an editing process with a novel of mine, I completely get what he's saying about. By the time you get to those last chapters, you are almost just like, yeah, this is fine, this is fine, this is
You're
fine.
just flying through those final pages.
Yeah,
Perfect. Doesn't
exactly.
change here.
Yeah, exactly. So I can totally see why one pass starting from the end and going to the start would have that effect of making sure you are paying attention to
Yeah,
that
and also
last
good
bit.
if you've got, I guess, reviews or twists, isn't it? Because you start with that and then you see, well, it's a groundwork laid as opposed to it does a twist land. You're looking at it backwards, but I mean, absolutely, it does sound nuts, but I can see the benefit of that, and it's something I am going to try because I'm interested to see how that works in practice.
Yeah, definitely. So, well, thanks very much to Rob for coming on to the podcast, and I'm really hoping that the Paradox Hotel gets a distribution deal in the UK soon.
Oh, for sure.
I really did enjoy The Warehouse a lot. Highly recommend it if you're into that sort of story. And yeah, Paradox Hotel sounds brilliant. So we'll put a link to Rob's books in the podcast description as usual. But next week we've got another great sci-fi guest.
Yeah, next week we're going to continue the sci-fi theme, especially with Rob and then with our Chimera appearance. We're going to have an interview with Martha Wells on next week. Martha Wells is, of course, best known for her Murderbot series of books, which are great fun. They're a combination of there's some novellas and there's some full-blown novels in there, and All Systems Red is the first one, and it's a kind of a story of a Terminator type robot which kind of changes its ways a little bit in it. But it's kind of like, well, not lighthearted, but it's a very unique type of story, the way it's told.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting to see into the head of the sentient AI as the main character, essentially. Yeah, highly recommend those novellas. But yeah, Martha was great fun to speak to. Now, of course, not just sci-fi, she's written a lot of fantasy as well. Also interesting that although she's a massive name, has written some great books, she had a period in her career where there was a big dip, and we talked to her about how do you deal with that after you've been successful, to suddenly find that happening to your career. How do you revive it again? So really good advice and interesting to hear from on that front as well. So please do tune in for that one. But if you enjoyed today's podcast, please do subscribe, give us a rating, give us a review. All of these things help us continue to get great guests on the podcast.
And of course, if anybody wants to get in touch with us, perhaps they want to send us a question for Adrian Tchaikovsky, they can, of course, get in touch by a variety
they better
of
be
methods.
quick if they're doing that.
Very quick. Well, with nothing quicker than electronic mail, and they can reach us by sending us an email to podcast@rightgear.co.uk, or they can send us a tweet in the Twitter machine, which is @UKPage1.
So we hope to hear from you with a question for Adrian on that. But otherwise, we'll speak to you next week.
See you later.
Well, we hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, be sure to hit that thumbs up button and hit the subscribe button so you never miss an episode like these ones down here.
And if you want to get in touch, you can do so by finding us on our social media platforms up here, or drop us a comment way down below there.
But otherwise, thanks for listening and join us for the next episode.
See you later.